In the quiet town of Sycamore Springs, Judge Richard Simmons, a respected figure in his mid-40s, sat behind the mahogany desk that had defined his career. As he ran his fingers across the grain, memories of years spent working within a system that constantly threatened to break him flooded his mind. For all his accomplishments, the weight of his position had begun to feel suffocating. He wasn't just a judge. He was the face of fairness, of progress in a system that often seemed too entrenched in corruption and prejudice to even attempt change. Yet, as Richard sat there, his thoughts were interrupted by a series of images that would forever alter the course of his life. Earlier that evening, what seemed like a routine traffic stop turned into a nightmare. Officer Mark Thompson, a man who had become infamous for his treatment of black defendants, pulled over Richard on a dark, deserted road. At first, it seemed like an innocent enough encounter, a misplaced taillight or a routine check, but everything changed when Thompson made his intentions clear. "Get out of the car," the officer growled, his voice laced with hostility. Richard had tried to defuse the situation with professionalism, offering his ID, explaining who he was, but Thompson's expression twisted with disdain, the badge he wore no longer a symbol of justice, but one of power and control. The officer threw his wallet aside as if it were worthless, forcing Richard to the ground with a harsh shove, spitting insults as he was cuffed. The air, thick with the scent of heat and the unsettling chirp of crickets, did nothing to cool Richard's rising frustration. There was no reason for this. None at all. Yet this was not the first time a black man had been humiliated by the likes of Thompson. It wouldn't be the last. What Richard had once thought was a battle confined to the courtroom had now become personal, visceral. As he was thrown into the back of the squad car, his mind raced, not only with anger, but with the chilling realization that the very system he had dedicated his life to serving was inherently flawed. And now it was turning on him. But this wasn't just about him. This was bigger than one unjust arrest. This was about the silent war fought every day in the streets, in the homes, in the courts. It was a fight Richard could no longer ignore. The officer's words rang in his ears, the mocking laughter of Thompson and the distant rumble of approaching backup making him feel smaller than he ever had before. The whole town had witnessed it, some silently, some with approval. His pride, his dignity, everything he had worked for, was slipping away in that moment. Yet there was a spark deep within him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He wasn't going down like this. He wouldn't let this injustice stand. And that is where you come in. If you stand for what's right, if you believe in the fight for justice, then hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this story, because it's not just Richard's fight. It's the fight of everyone who has ever felt silenced by a broken system. Together, we can stand against this tide of corruption and bring true justice to light. In the heart of Sycamore Springs, a town that seemed to echo with the calm hum of everyday life, Judge Richard Simmons was a symbol of justice. The walls of his courtroom, lined with the histories of countless cases, stood as a testament to years of hard work, sacrifice, and a deep belief in the system he had fought so hard to be a part of. At 45, Richard had earned his place. As a black judge in a town not known for its progressive views, every day had been a battle. His seat on the bench hard-won, his very presence a symbol of progress. The road to this point hadn't been easy. Richard had fought through a system that was often tilted against men like him, slowly and methodically building his reputation, one ruling at a time. He had earned respect, carved out a space where his voice was heard, and slowly the tides of Sycamore Springs began to shift. But that evening, as the amber glow of the setting sun bled into the horizon, everything began to change. It was supposed to be a quiet night, a small reprieve from the demands of his position, as Richard cruised down the tree-lined streets of his town in his sleek black Mercedes. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the evening air, cool against the heat of a long day. He could already imagine the comfort of home, his wife, Naomi, awaiting him, her soft laughter and the scent of her cooking filling the space. Richard always found solace in these drives. They were his ritual, the calm before the storm of another day in court, of more cases, more hearings, more arguments from the desperate, the broken, and the lost. His thoughts were briefly interrupted by the soft jazz playing on the radio, its smooth rhythms blending with the flicker of streetlights and the comforting buzz of the cicadas in the air. It was a peaceful drive. He felt for the first time in a while safe. But that peace shattered in an instant. The sirens behind him cut through the air like a blade. Richard's body tensed instinctively. He could see the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror, their intensity almost blinding. His heart skipped a beat, and the familiar weight of unease settled over him. The officer trailing him in the cruiser was close, too close, and Richard knew what that could mean. He had been through this 100 times before. He knew how the system worked, or rather, how it failed black men like him. The flashing lights, the suspicion, the fear. It was a dangerous game, especially for someone with his skin. He eased off the gas, signaling to the shoulder of the road. The gravel crunched under the tires as he pulled over. There was no reason to panic, not yet. Maybe it was a simple check, a routine stop. He'd been careful, always. He had followed the rules. He had done everything right. The officer's footsteps approached, deliberate and slow, the weight of them pressing down on Richard's chest. The man's shadow fell over him, towering as the flashlight beam pierced through the window, blinding him for a moment. Richard squinted, his brow furrowing. Officer Mark Thompson, a man Richard had heard rumors about, stood there in his full uniform, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched tight. Thompson was no stranger to abuse of power, no stranger to using his position to intimidate and control. He had always been known as a cop who believed in keeping order, but his idea of order didn't exactly align with the law. His presence, his posture, everything about this felt wrong. Without a word of explanation, Thompson slammed his flashlight against the window, his voice dripping with a cruel command. "Get out of the car." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't an order issued with courtesy or professionalism. It was an order soaked in venom. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to remain calm, tried to stay professional. He rolled the window down, his palms now clammy on the steering wheel. "Officer, what's this about?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising storm in his chest. He could feel it. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the world had just tilted against him. Thompson's sneer was immediate, his voice hard, laced with a malicious edge. "I said get out now!" There was no room for negotiation in his tone, no room for reason. Richard's mind raced. He had done nothing wrong. He was a judge. He had earned his place, his respect. And yet here he was, pulled over like a criminal, treated like a suspect. He reached for his wallet, his movements slow, deliberate. He wasn't afraid, not yet. He had been through worse. He was Richard Simmons, judge of Sycamore Springs, and this would pass. But as he handed Thompson his ID, a gesture meant to diffuse the situation. Something in the officer's eyes flickered. The usual recognition didn't come. The change in Thompson's demeanor was swift, and it was ugly. Instead of taking the ID, The officer slapped it down onto the roof of the Mercedes, the sound sharp and insulting. "Don't care who you think you are," Thompson spat, his tone venomous. Something inside Richard snapped, but he held it back, kept it buried deep. He couldn't let this escalate. Not like this. Not in front of the world. Not for the sake of his career. His family. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, trying to hold himself steady as Thompson loomed over him, casting a long shadow. "This your car?" Thompson asked, the question dripping with mockery. Richard nodded, keeping his hands loose at his sides, though the urge to clench them into fists was almost unbearable. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Bought it last month. Papers are in the glove box." Instead of checking, Thompson's gaze turned colder, more hostile. "Looks like a stolen ride to me," he muttered, his voice laced with suspicion, as if every black man driving a luxury car was guilty by default. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the anger show. This wasn't about him. Not yet. He had to stay calm. He had to show control. But Thompson's hand grabbed his arm then, twisting it behind his back, and Richard winced as pain shot through his shoulder. "You don't tell me what to do, boy," Thompson growled, the racial slur slipping from his lips with a disgusting ease. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he was slammed face first against the hood of his car, the heat from the engine searing into his chest. Pain radiated through him, sharp and brutal, but he bit his lip, refusing to cry out. In that moment, Richard realized that this wasn't just a traffic stop. This wasn't just about a routine check. This was about something bigger. This was about a system designed to humiliate, to break, and to control men like him. And somehow, he had found himself trapped in its grip. As Thompson's knee dug into his spine, the pain was almost secondary to the humiliation, to the crushing weight of everything he had worked for being stripped away in an instant. But Richard wasn't going to let that happen. He wouldn't. As the officer snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, the sound of them clicking shut felt like the final nail in his coffin. He was under arrest, thrown into the back of a squad car, humiliated in front of his town. The night stretched on, the weight of it hanging over him like a storm cloud. The air was thick with the distant sound of sirens, and the world outside the precinct seemed to pulse with the same fear Richard had felt when he first saw those flashing lights. But in the holding cell, as he sat there with his back against the cold concrete, his mind began to sharpen. This wasn't just about a corrupt cop. This wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. This was about something deeper. Something that had been simmering beneath the surface of Sycamore Springs for years. Richard had always known the system was broken. But now, as he sat in a cell, his identity stripped away, he could feel the rot beneath it all, creeping in. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about all of them. As he was released hours later, his body battered, his mind reeling, Richard knew that the battle had just begun. The world outside had already started to shift in ways he couldn't control. Naomi, his wife, was waiting for him, but the world had changed. The injustice wasn't just a nightmarish encounter, it was an awakening. And in that awakening, Richard realized that he couldn't back down. He couldn't just let this go. Not when everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was at stake. And that's where you come in. You've been with him through this. If you believe in justice, if you believe in standing against the tide, then hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story. Because the fight for justice doesn't end here. Richard's battle is just beginning. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this relentless fight. This is a fight for his future, for his community, and for every man and woman who has ever felt powerless in a system that turns on them. Join us, and let's stand tall together. In the town of Oak Ridge, nestled between rolling hills and sprawling forests, Judge Raymond Harris was more than just a figurehead. He was the pillar of a justice system that had often been seen as flawed. But with Raymond at the helm, there was a belief, one held dearly by the people of Oak Ridge, that justice could still be fair. At 50 years old, Raymond had weathered the storm of systemic discrimination, his rise through the ranks of law, fueled by an unyielding commitment to fairness, to righting wrongs, and to giving a voice to those who were often ignored by the powers that be. As a black judge in a small town where diversity was rare, Raymond had always known his position would require more than just legal expertise. It would demand strength, patience, and the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. But despite the constant uphill battle, he had earned the respect of his peers, the trust of his community, and the fear of those who sought to undermine the very principles he stood for. It was a rainy evening in Oak Ridge when Raymond's life was shattered. The storm clouds rolled in as he made his way home after a long day in court. The streets were slick with rain, the sound of tires on wet asphalt echoing in the silence of the night. Raymond's black Mercedes glided smoothly down the road, his thoughts lost in the events of the day. A particularly difficult case had left him drained. A young man, unjustly accused, had pleaded for mercy, his voice cracking as he recounted the horrors he had faced. Raymond had given him a chance, an opportunity to prove his innocence. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had become a judge in the first place. But even as he offered that chance, he couldn't shake the feeling that the system he was a part of was broken beyond repair. As Raymond neared the end of his drive, the familiar red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, pulling him from his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual to be pulled over, but in his case, it always felt different. The officer trailing him, Deputy Jake Turner, was known for his brash demeanor and disregard for the law, a man who saw power as something to be wielded with force rather than responsibility. Raymond had seen his name in the courtroom a few times, and he wasn't surprised to find Turner pulling up behind him now. The officer had a reputation for being more than a little discriminatory, especially toward people of color, and Raymond knew that for men like him, a simple traffic stop could quickly escalate into something far worse. He eased his foot off the gas and slowed, signaling as he pulled over to the shoulder. The gravel crunched under the tires as he stopped, the rhythmic sound somehow louder than the pounding rain outside. He killed the radio and sat still, his hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, breathing deeply, trying to calm the unease gnawing at the pit of his stomach. The lights behind him flickered as Turner's car came to a halt, the officer stepping out of his cruiser with deliberate steps. His boots thudded against the pavement, each one feeling like a drumbeat to the impending confrontation. The light from his flashlight stabbed through the window, blinding Raymond momentarily. He squinted, trying to make out the officer's figure, but it wasn't hard to guess who was standing there. "Evening, Judge Harris," Turner said, his voice a low growl. "Step out of the car." Raymond's heart pounded in his chest. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm, professional. He didn't want to escalate things. Not here, not now. "Get out of the car," Turner barked again, this time slamming his flashlight against the window with such force that it made Raymond flinch. There was no courtesy in the officer's voice, no hint of respect for his position. There was only malice, a hunger for power that Raymond had seen far too many times in his career. He didn't recognize the man in front of him anymore. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was something darker. Raymond reached for his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate as he pulled out his identification. "I'm Judge Raymond Harris," he said, offering it to Turner through the window. You can run my ID. There's no need for this. Turner didn't even look at the ID. He slapped it away, the sound of it hitting the roof of the car like a slap to Raymond's pride. I don't care who you are, Turner said, his voice dripping with venom. Get out of the car now, or I'll pull you out. Something inside Raymond snapped. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the sting of injustice clawing at him, but he kept his composure. This wasn't about him. Not really. It was about the system. The same system that had failed countless others like him. The same system that had shown its ugly face time and time again. But Raymond knew one thing above all else. He couldn't let this man win. Not like this. Not in front of the world. Fine, Raymond said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he opened the door. The moment his feet hit the gravel, Turner was on him, shoving him hard against the hood of the car. The heat from the engine seared through his jacket, and Raymond grunted, trying to maintain his balance as Turner pressed his knee into his spine, forcing him down. He could feel the officer's breath on his neck, the taste of contempt in the air. This your car? Turner asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Raymond's mouth went dry. He could feel the anger building inside him, but he swallowed it down, focusing on his breath. He had to stay in control. He couldn't let this man break him. Yes, Raymond replied, his voice a little hoarse now. It's mine. Turner didn't respond. Instead, he yanked Raymond's arm behind his back, twisting it painfully, snapping the cuffs around his wrists with a force that made his shoulders scream. The officer's words were filled with venom. You're under arrest, he said, his voice triumphant. Raymond stumbled, his legs unsteady as he was pushed into the back of the squad car. His mind was racing. The pain in his shoulders, the crushing weight of the cuffs, all felt distant, secondary to the realization that everything he had worked for, the respect, the honor, the position he had fought so hard to earn, was being ripped away from him in this moment. He was no longer Judge Raymond Harris. He was just another black man in the eyes of the law. A criminal. He was driven to the precinct in silence, the hum of the car's engine the only sound that accompanied him. His thoughts were a whirlwind. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was a judge. He had earned his place. And yet here he was, cuffed and humiliated, unable to stop the tide of fear and anger that surged within him. He had always known the system was corrupt. But this was different. This was personal. When he was finally shoved into the holding cell, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering overhead, he sat on the cold metal bench, his head in his hands. The muffled sounds of voices and the ringing of phones from the front desk seemed distant, as if they came from a world far removed from his own. He couldn't wrap his head around what had just happened. How had it all come to this? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers. Only the gnawing feeling that something had been set in motion that he couldn't stop. Hours passed. The world outside the cell seemed to move on without him, indifferent to the injustice he had just experienced. But Raymond couldn't let it go. He couldn't allow himself to be broken. Not like this. Not when he knew the fight for justice had only just begun. When he was finally released, hours later, the world outside felt different. The weight of the rain seemed to follow him home, each drop a reminder of the battle he had just endured. But as he stepped into his house, Naomi's arms wrapping around him, the warmth of her embrace, he realized that he hadn't been defeated. Not yet. She held him tight, her voice trembling with worry as she whispered, "You're okay. You're home." But Raymond knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The events of that night were just the beginning. The fight for justice, for his dignity, for his place in the world, had only just begun. And this time, he wouldn't be standing alone. If you believe in justice, If you believe in standing up against the system, don't just stand by. Like, subscribe and join us as we continue this journey with Raymond, as he fights not just for his name, but for everyone who has ever been silenced by a corrupt system. Stay tuned. The battle is far from over. The once bustling streets of Marlow City had always echoed with the promises of justice. A city where the law was said to stand firm, a beacon of hope for the oppressed and downtrodden. But as the years went on, its soul seemed to wither, the gleaming courthouse walls hiding the rot beneath. And at the heart of that decay was Judge Julian Mitchell. At just 38, Julian had been a rising star in the legal world. A black man who had fought his entire life to secure a position in a system that had never fully accepted him, Julian had faced rejection, exclusion, and prejudice at every turn. But where others would have broken, he had persevered. He had clawed his way up from nothing, with nothing but a fierce sense of right and wrong to guide him. His law degree from a prestigious university had been earned with late nights, endless studying, and the belief that he could change the system from within. And for a while, it seemed like he had succeeded. Julian had come to be known as a fair, even-handed judge, someone who would hear out both sides of a case, someone who wouldn't allow his emotions to cloud his judgment. He had the respect of his colleagues, the trust of the community, and most importantly, the belief that he was doing something good. He thought he had found his purpose. But then came the case that shattered everything. It was a routine hearing, or so he thought, just another day at the courthouse. A young man named Michael Brown, accused of a minor crime, possessing marijuana with the intent to sell. Michael was 21, his life still ahead of him, but the system had already written him off as another statistic. Julian, as always, was determined to give him a fair trial. He knew that the war on drugs disproportionately targeted black men like Michael, and that made the case hit a little too close to home. As the trial progressed, Julian became increasingly disillusioned with the way things were playing out. Michael's defense attorney was a young woman, barely out of law school, but she had fire in her eyes. She made compelling arguments about racial profiling, the harsh sentencing for non-violent offenders, and how the system was rigged to destroy young black lives. But Julian's colleagues, the prosecutors, and even the jury seemed unmoved. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension as everyone waited for Julian's verdict. The truth was, he already knew what he was going to do, but the weight of the decision bore down on him, suffocating him with the knowledge that no matter what he decided, someone would see it as a betrayal. The day of the sentencing arrived, and Julian sat in his chambers, staring out at the sprawling city below. The city he had sworn to serve, the city that had been so quick to turn its back on him when he needed it most. He thought about his own rise through the legal system, how he had been the only black face in a sea of white judges and lawyers. He thought about the long hours he had spent in law school, the racist comments from colleagues that had stung. But he had kept pushing forward, believing that his work would one day make a difference. But now, as he sat at his desk, Julian felt the weight of the years pressing down on him, the weight of his past decisions, his good intentions, and his failures. He knew that Michael's life hung in the balance. He knew the system would do everything it could to bury him, just like it had buried so many others. And yet, deep inside, Julian wondered if he was just another cog in the machine, another black man who had tried to work within the system only to be crushed by its flaws. He couldn't help but ask himself, was it enough to simply be fair when fairness didn't exist for people like Michael? As the clock ticked closer to the hour of the verdict, Julian's thoughts grew more clouded. He heard the knock at his door, and before he could respond, his assistant, Claire, stepped in with a stack of papers. She was a bright, young woman who had always admired Julian's integrity, the way he had always stood up for what was right. Claire didn't say anything as she set the papers down on his desk, but Julian could see the concern in her eyes. She knew what he was up against. She knew the stakes. And when she finally spoke, her voice trembled, betraying her own fear. "Are you sure about this, Judge Mitchell? Are you sure you can stand by this decision?" The question hit Julian like a punch to the gut. He knew what Claire was asking. She was asking if he was willing to risk everything. The career he had built, the respect he had earned, and the reputation he had so carefully cultivated. She was asking if he was willing to take a stand, to finally break free from the chains that had bound him to a corrupt system. The truth was, Julian wasn't sure. But as he looked at her, he knew one thing for certain. If he didn't stand up now, if he didn't make the right call, he would lose himself forever. The courthouse was packed when Julian walked into the courtroom that afternoon. The tension in the air was palpable, a collective breath held as they waited for him to speak. Julian stepped up to the bench, his hands shaking as he lifted his gavel. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the jury, the reporters. But it wasn't the crowd he was thinking about. It was Michael. It was the weight of the decision he had to make. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice steady, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else. "The sentence in this case is a difficult one," Julian began, his voice carrying across the room. "But the truth is, I cannot in good conscience send this young man to prison. Not when I know that this system is broken. Not when I know that Michael Brown is a victim of a war on drugs that has targeted his community for decades. Not when I know that the punishment does not fit the crime." There was a collective gasp from the room as Julian's words sank in. He could feel the eyes of the prosecutors on him, could hear the murmurs of disbelief. But it was Michael's face that kept him going. Michael's eyes filled with hope as Julian's voice rang out. For the first time in years, Julian felt the power of his position. It was no longer about the system. It was about him, about his voice, about the difference he could make. "I'm sentencing you to probation," Julian said, his voice unwavering. "You will attend a rehabilitation program and complete 200 hours of community service. But you will not go to prison." The room fell silent. The jury stared at him, and the prosecutor's face turned a shade of red Julian had never seen before. But Julian didn't care. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He cared about Michael. He cared about the message he was sending. When the court session ended, Julian was met with immediate backlash. The media stormed the courthouse, reporters pushing microphones into his face, demanding explanations. His phone rang off the hook with angry calls from colleagues, his inbox flooded with emails of condemnation. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. In the following days, Julian was called to account for his decision, with the city's leaders pushing for his removal from the bench. His career, which had once seemed so certain, now hung in the balance. The pressure was immense. But despite it all, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that he had done the right thing. Michael was free, and that was all that mattered. But as the days turned into weeks, Julian began to feel the weight of the isolation. The friends he had once trusted began to turn their backs on him, his colleagues whispering behind his back. It was as though the city itself had rejected him. The public turned on him, calling him biased, accusing him of coddling criminals. His reputation, once revered, was now tarnished by the very same system he had worked so hard to uphold. As Julian walked through the streets of Marlow City, he couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal, the bitterness of standing alone. He had risked everything for Michael, for justice. And yet, it seemed like the city would never forgive him for it. He had always known the fight for justice was not easy. But this was different. This was personal. He had sacrificed his career, his relationships, and his sense of belonging in a city that had always made him feel like an outsider. And now, as he faced the fallout, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. But through the storm, one thing kept him going: the small glimmer of hope in Michael's eyes when he was freed. Michael had promised to turn his life around, to fight for his community, to be a beacon of hope for others. And Julian believed in him. He had to. He couldn't let this decision be for nothing. So Julian stood tall, despite the weight of the world pressing down on him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew one thing: the fight for justice was far from over. And if you believe in standing tall, in supporting those who fight for what's right, don't let Julian's story end here. Like, subscribe, and join him on this journey as he continues to battle against a broken system. Let's stand together for justice, for Michael, and for the future. Because when we fight not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's ever been silenced. Stay tuned. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the courthouse, as Judge Julian Mitchell sat alone in his chambers. The weight of the world seemed to rest squarely on his shoulders. He had built his life in this city, in this very courtroom, clawing his way up through the suffocating cracks of a system that had never fully embraced him. Julian Mitchell, at 38, was a man who had spent his entire life being defined by his race, his position, and his unwavering belief in justice. He was a black man in a predominantly white institution, and for years he had worked tirelessly to earn the respect of his colleagues and the trust of his community. But the price of that success had been high. He had given up everything he loved, all in the pursuit of proving that he was worthy, that he was enough. There were times when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. Late nights, early mornings, the never-ending parade of cases, and the brutal realities of the legal system had worn him down. He'd witnessed firsthand how the system that he had sworn to uphold often failed the very people it was meant to protect, especially those who looked like him. Still, Julian held on to his belief that he could change the system from within, that his position as a judge would allow him to make the world a better place. He had always believed that if he could just show people that he was different, that he was above the stereotypes, that maybe, just maybe, the scales of justice would tip in his favor. But as he sat in his chambers, staring at the case before him, Julian felt an overwhelming sense of doubt. This case, this one particular case, had shattered everything he thought he knew. It was supposed to be a routine hearing. Just another young man, another minor crime. Michael Brown, a 21-year-old black man, had been arrested for possessing marijuana with intent to sell. It wasn't the crime itself that troubled Julian. He had presided over cases far more complex and dangerous. It was the truth of the matter, the underlying currents of racial profiling, the systemic bias, and the crushing weight of a history that had always stacked the odds against people like Michael. It wasn't just about marijuana. It was about the fact that Michael, like so many others, was already presumed guilty the moment he walked into that courtroom, simply because of the color of his skin. Julian had heard the arguments from both sides, the prosecutor's cold, unrelenting stance, and the defense attorney's impassioned plea for justice. But it was the young defense lawyer, a woman named Tamara, who had truly struck a chord with him. She wasn't just fighting for Michael. She was fighting for something bigger, something more profound. She spoke of how the war on drugs had disproportionately targeted black communities, of how Michael's fate had been sealed the moment he was born into a world that had already decided his worth. Her words echoed in Julian's mind long after the trial was over, and as he sat alone in his chambers, Julian could feel the pressure building. How could he send a man like Michael to prison? How could he contribute to a system that had already decided his fate before he even had a chance? But there was something else that gnawed at him. Something darker. What if Julian's own success in the system had come at the cost of his soul? What if, in trying to fit into a system that had always excluded him, he had lost his way? As the day of the verdict loomed, Julian found himself unable to sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and guilt. He thought about his own rise to the bench, the endless nights spent studying, the countless times he had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. He had worked so hard, so relentlessly, to prove that he was good enough, that he could be better than the system that had so often denied him. He had told himself that his place in the courtroom would give him the power to change things from within. But now, as the decision weighed heavily on him, he realized that no matter what he did, no matter how he ruled, it would never be enough. The system was too broken. The wounds ran too deep. Michael's case was just one more reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be a part of a system that was built to fail. The morning of the verdict, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. The usual crowd of reporters, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and onlookers had gathered, each with their own preconceived notions about what the outcome should be. Julian entered the courtroom, his robe heavy on his shoulders, his mind a blur of conflicting thoughts. He had never felt so alone in his life. Every step he took felt like a march toward his own personal reckoning. When he sat behind the bench and looked out at the sea of faces, he knew that this was it. This was the moment that would define him. The courtroom fell silent as Julian rose, his gavel in hand. His eyes swept over the room, landing on Michael, whose fate rested in Julian's hands. The young man sat quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he awaited the judgment. Julian's heart ached for him. Michael was just another victim of a system that had never given him a fair chance. And now, Julian had to make the decision that would either condemn him or set him free. Julian cleared his throat. The words caught in his chest. "The decision in this case," he began, his voice shaky, "is one that I have struggled with deeply. This is not just a case of possession. This is a case about a young man whose life has been shaped by the weight of a system that has already decided his fate long before he ever stepped into this courtroom. And the truth is, the system has failed him. It has failed all of us." The murmurs in the room grew louder, but Julian pressed on, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I cannot in good conscience sentence Michael Brown to prison. Not when I know that the system is built to imprison men like him. Not when I know that this case, like so many others, is a reflection of a much larger issue. I will not be a part of that." The room erupted in shock. Gasps, muttered curses, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the air. Julian's colleagues shot him looks of disbelief, some with anger, others with pity. The prosecutor stood in shock, mouth agape, unable to process what Julian had just said. But in that moment, none of it mattered, because Julian knew he had made the right choice. "I am sentencing Michael to probation," Julian continued, his words firm. "He will attend rehabilitation, perform community service, and he will be given the chance to turn his life around. But he will not go to prison." And for the first time in a long while, Julian felt a sense of peace. He had made the right decision. The decision that went against everything the system stood for, but the decision that was, for once, truly just. He had chosen to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And as Michael's face lit up with tears of gratitude, Julian knew that this was the moment that would change everything. But the backlash was immediate. The media, the public, his colleagues, everyone turned on him. The phone calls came flooding in, each one more furious than the last. The reporters ambushed him at every turn, demanding explanations, calling him biased, accusing him of being soft on crime. His inbox was filled with hate mail, the words cruel and biting. But Julian didn't care. For the first time in his career, he didn't care about the consequences. He cared about the people who needed him, who needed someone to fight for them. In the days that followed, Julian was subjected to a brutal campaign of public humiliation. His colleagues tried to distance themselves from him, making veiled threats to undermine his position. The city's leaders called for his removal from the bench, accusing him of being unfit to serve. His entire career, everything he had worked for, was crumbling before his eyes. The courtroom he had once stood proudly in now felt like a foreign land, one where he was no longer welcome. But even in the midst of this turmoil, Julian refused to back down. He couldn't. He had made his choice, and no matter what happened next, he would stand by it. He would fight for Michael, for justice, for the truth. Because in the end, the truth was the only thing that mattered. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. But Julian's decision to stand up for what was right, to take a stand against a broken system, began to inspire others. The protests grew louder, more widespread. People began to rally around him, their voices rising in solidarity. And slowly, ever so slowly, the tide began to turn. But the road ahead was far from easy. Julian had lost everything: his career, his reputation, his place in the system. But he had gained something far more valuable: his integrity. And though the path was uncertain, Julian Mitchell knew that he would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for the countless others who were silenced by a system that had never truly seen them. And if you believe in standing tall, if you believe in justice, if you believe in the power of one person to make a difference, then you owe it to yourself to support Julian. Hit like, subscribe, and share this story. Let's remind the world that no matter the cost, the fight for justice is worth it. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the courthouse as Judge Julian Mitchell stood alone in his chambers, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His hands gripped the cold, polished wood of his desk, but it did little to steady the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had spent years building his reputation, fighting tooth and nail for a seat in the courtroom, only to find that the system he had dedicated his life to was not just flawed, it was broken beyond repair. Julian's story wasn't a simple one. It was one of struggle, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a world that didn't always seem to care. At 38, Julian was a black man sitting at the top of an institution that had never fully embraced him. He had spent years fighting his way to this point, working harder than anyone else, trying to prove that he was worthy, that he could be just as good, if not better, than those who came before him. Every day, every ruling, every judgment was another test of his resolve, another opportunity to show that despite the odds, despite the deep-seated racism and biases of the system, he could make a difference. But lately, Julian had begun to question if it wasn't enough. The cases were starting to blur together. The faces in front of him were too familiar in their hopelessness, in their silent plea for justice that often went unanswered. It wasn't just about the cases anymore. It was about his soul. Julian had always believed that by becoming a judge, he could change the system from the inside. He thought that if he could just play the game better, work harder, be smarter, maybe he could make things right. But as he sat in his chambers, staring at the case in front of him, His faith in that belief was slowly crumbling. The case was a simple one on the surface. A young man named Michael Brown, arrested for possession of marijuana with intent to sell. A minor crime? Nothing extraordinary. But for Julian, this case felt different. It wasn't just about marijuana or the crime itself. It was about a young man whose fate had already been decided for him long before he even set foot in that courtroom. Michael was just another black man in a broken system, a system that had already branded him guilty. The prosecutor had already assumed his guilt. The defense had already assumed his innocence. But Julian knew the truth was somewhere in between. This wasn't about the crime. It was about the system that had set this young man up for failure from the beginning. As the trial progressed, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He listened to the arguments, watched as the prosecutor relentlessly pushed for a harsh sentence, and saw the defense attorney fight for a chance at redemption for his client. But what stuck with him the most was the words of the young defense lawyer, Tamara, who spoke with such passion and fire that it seemed to ignite something deep within Julian. She wasn't just defending Michael. She was defending an entire generation of young black men and women who had been failed by the system. She spoke of how Michael's arrest was just another example of racial profiling, of how the war on drugs had devastated black communities for decades, and how, despite the statistics, nothing ever changed. It wasn't just about this case. It was about the years of injustice, the years of lives lost to a system that didn't care. Julian felt the weight of that truth deep in his chest. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't look at Michael and see just another criminal. He saw a young man who had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect him. He saw the reflection of his younger self, lost, forgotten, a casualty of a system that had never truly seen him for who he was. As the trial ended and the day of the verdict approached, Julian found himself questioning everything. His career, his choices, his very purpose in the courtroom. Was he part of the problem? Had he spent all these years playing by the rules of a system that was inherently unjust? He had worked so hard to get here. He had fought so hard to prove that he was good enough, that he belonged. But now, as he prepared to make this final decision, he wondered if any of it had been worth it. The morning of the verdict, the courthouse was abuzz with tension. Julian could feel the eyes of the entire city on him, his colleagues, the media, the public, all waiting for him to make his decision. The pressure was suffocating, and as he stepped into the courtroom, it felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The case before him was supposed to be a routine one, a simple decision in a sea of many. But in this moment, it felt like everything was on the line. When Julian rose from his seat behind the bench, the room fell silent. His gavel felt heavy in his hand, a symbol of the power he had spent so many years trying to earn. But as he looked out over the sea of faces, Michael sitting nervously in the defendant's chair, the prosecutor glaring at him, and the defense attorney, Tamara, waiting with a hopeful look. He knew that this wasn't just a case. This was a turning point. With his heart racing, Julian spoke, his voice steady but raw. "I have struggled with this decision," he began, his gaze never leaving Michael. "But the truth is, this case is not just about marijuana. It's about a young man who has been trapped by a system that has already decided his fate before he even had a chance to make his own choices. It's about the fact that people like Michael are constantly given the short end of the stick simply because of the color of their skin." The courtroom was silent as Julian continued, his words coming from a place of deep conviction. "I will not be a part of a system that perpetuates this injustice. Michael Brown will not go to prison. He will be sentenced to probation, to community service, and he will be given the chance to rebuild his life." Gasps filled the room. Shock rippled through the gallery, and Julian could feel the anger, the disbelief, the judgment from his colleagues, from the prosecutor, and from the public. This was not the decision they had expected. This was not what the system had trained him to do. He could already hear the cries of soft on crime and liberal agenda. He could already feel the pressure mounting, the weight of every judgment he had ever faced in his life bearing down on him. But in that moment, Julian didn't care. He had made his choice, and it felt like the right one. For once, he had chosen to stand on the side of justice, no matter what the cost. He had chosen to fight for what was right, even if it meant losing everything. As the days passed, the fallout was immediate and harsh. The media erupted with fury, calling Julian everything from naive to biased. His colleagues turned their backs on him, calling for his removal from the bench, accusing him of being unfit to serve. The city's leaders spoke out against him, demanding that his decision be overturned. His reputation, his career, everything he had worked for, began to crumble in front of him. Julian had given everything to the system, and now the system was betraying him. But what kept him going through it all was the knowledge that he had done the right thing. He had not been swayed by the pressures of those who wanted to maintain the status quo. He had taken a stand for something bigger than himself. Even as the public backlash grew louder and the threats against his career escalated, Julian remained steadfast. His decision had cost him everything: his job, his respect, his place in the system. But it had also given him something more important. It had given him his integrity. The weeks that followed were filled with protests, with passionate cries for justice, but also with vitriol, with anger, and with a city divided. Julian walked the streets, feeling the weight of the people's expectations and their contempt. But through it all, he never wavered. He knew that what he had done was right, but the road ahead was not an easy one. Julian knew that the fight for justice was not over, that the system he had spent his life working within would never truly change without a massive shift. The struggle had only just begun, and despite the deep pain of betrayal, Julian found himself ready to fight again. If you believe in standing tall for what is right, even when the cost is too high, if you believe in the power of one person to make a difference in the face of overwhelming odds, then you owe it to yourself to support Julian. This battle is far from over, and your voice can make a difference. Hit like, subscribe, and share this story with everyone who needs to hear it. Let's remind the world that standing for justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. We need more people like Julian, who refuse to back down, who refuse to be silenced. This is just the beginning, and together we can make sure that justice doesn't stop here. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a fiery orange glow over Stonehaven, Georgia. The day had come to a close, but for Marcus Langston, the journey he had been on was far from over. His life had been a whirlwind of betrayal, injustice, and moments of unexpected courage. Now, standing in the ruins of everything he had worked for, he knew that the most important battle of his life had just begun. Despite the threats, the attacks, the lies, and the betrayal from those he trusted the most, Marcus had refused to let the darkness consume him. The brutal truth was that life had tested him in ways he never thought possible. Yet, in the heart of all that chaos, Marcus had found something profound. He had discovered his true strength. As Marcus sat quietly in the living room, the echoes of a bomb blast and the broken glass of shattered windows still hung in the air. Naomi, his wife, sat beside him, her hand gently squeezing his, a small but powerful reminder that despite everything they had lost, they still had each other. The house was quiet now, the weight of the world momentarily lifted by the simple presence of love. Naomi's face had been marked with the bruises of their fight, both physical and emotional, but there was a fire in her eyes, a sense of resolve that mirrored his own. "We've been through hell," Marcus murmured, looking out at the remnants of the home they had built. The shattered windows, the bullet holes in the walls, the faint smell of smoke from the fire that had destroyed his beloved Mercedes. All of it had been designed to break him. And yet here he was, still standing. The man who had been vilified, attacked, and humiliated by the very system he had once fought for had risen from the ashes stronger than ever. Marcus had thought the fight was about justice, the ideal that had once fueled his every action. He had believed that by working within the system, he could change things, fix what was broken. But over time, he had come to understand that justice wasn't something that could be achieved in the courtroom alone. Justice was a choice. It was about standing up when no one else would. It was about making the tough decisions even when the odds were stacked against you. Marcus had fought for justice, but what had truly shaped him was the fight to protect what mattered most: his integrity, his family, and the hope that one day things would be different. The story of Marcus Langston wasn't just about a man trying to make the world a better place. It was about a man who learned to see the world for what it was, the good and the bad, and refused to allow the darkness to define him. It was about standing up against corruption, standing against hate, and refusing to back down, no matter how hard the world tried to tear him apart. His story was a testament to resilience, a reminder that no matter how deep the scars, no matter how many times you're knocked down, there is always a way forward. And that's the lesson Marcus learned, and one that we can all carry with us. You are stronger than you think. When the world feels like it's crumbling around you, when every step forward feels like a battle, when the weight of failure threatens to suffocate you, it's easy to feel powerless. It's easy to let despair take root. But Marcus Langston's story is proof that no matter how dark it gets, you can find your way through. You can rise from the ashes and rebuild, not just your life, but your spirit. In the final moments of his journey, Marcus had to make a decision. Would he let the darkness swallow him, or would he rise above it? The choice was his, and he chose to fight back. He chose to stand tall in the face of adversity, to fight for his beliefs, and to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. This is the essence of what it means to live a life of purpose, to never give up, to fight for what's right, even when the world is stacked against you. Just as Marcus refused to let Boone's campaign of hate define him, we too can choose to rise above the challenges we face. The road won't be easy. There will be times when we feel overwhelmed, when we question our strength. But remember Marcus. Remember his fight. He may have lost many things along the way, his home, his reputation, even his beloved car, but he had something far more valuable: the knowledge that no one, no system, no enemy could ever take his spirit. And so, as Marcus faced the future, he didn't know exactly what it would hold. There would still be battles to fight, still injustices to uncover, and still challenges to overcome. But he wasn't alone. With Naomi by his side, with the lessons he had learned, and with a heart full of resolve, Marcus knew that the road ahead, though difficult, would be worth it. The fight was never just about winning. It was about standing up, about fighting for those who couldn't, and about proving that in the end, truth and integrity always matter. As you reflect on Marcus Langston's journey, take with you the wisdom he gained from his trials. Life will never be without struggle. The path to justice, to truth, and to peace is filled with obstacles. But it's in those moments of darkness that you will discover just how strong you truly are. Don't give up. No matter how many times you fall, rise again. The fight is never over. And remember, it's never too late to choose the right side. If you've been moved by Marcus's story and believe in standing tall for justice, like and comment below to show your support for the character. If you believe that courage, resilience, and integrity are qualities worth fighting for, subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales of perseverance and triumph. We need stories like Marcus's to inspire us to keep fighting, no matter what life throws our way. Share this journey with others who need to hear it. Let's build a community of strength, hope, and the belief that even in our darkest moments, we can rise stronger than ever before.